Ed, and today we'll be doing our first video on the Space Marine weaponry and technology. Now, I've talked a little bit about the Space Marines, so I won't go into that today. What I'll do is go straight into talking a little bit about the weaponry and technology that the Space Marines can bring to bear in the universe of Warhammer 40,000. Now, most Space Marine weaponry is actually more advanced than most of the Imperium, as the Space Marines are seen as the sons of the Emperor. They are above most of humanity and thus are given the best that can be provided to them by the Tech Priests of Mars, in order for them to make the most efficient warfare against the enemies of the Imperium. Now, as I said, the first video here will be about the Space Marines weaponry, and the next video that we'll be bringing to you will be concerning the Space Marines armour, the Space Marines technology, and the Space Marines vehicles, including dreadnoughts. I apologise for not mentioning them before, but they shall be mentioned now. So let's begin talking about Space Marine weaponry. Now, the most common type of weaponry wielded by the Space Marines is actually ranged weaponry, and there are a huge variety of items that can be used by the Space Marines in this regard. Now, the most common piece of weaponry you will have seen with a Space Marine, if any of you have ever seen a Space Marine of course, is the bolt gun. It's also known as a bolter, and is the standard weapon of the Space Marines. It is a .75 caliber weapon, so that's quite a large caliber, and it fires self-propelled explosive bolts, or mass reactive shells that are designed to explode once they enter the flesh or armour of an enemy, and effectively it is designed to blow the enemy up from the inside, a little bit like armour-penetrating anti-tank weaponry seen in a modern-day warfare. Now, a lot of bolt guns will be crafted by the Adeptus Mechanicus, and are designed to be heavy and sturdy. In fact, they're so large and powerful that it's almost impossible for a normal human being to actually use a Space Marine bolter without shattering their own wrists by the recoil that it provides. In fact, in the lore of Warhammer 40,000, it is considered heresy for a normal human being to touch the weaponry of a Space Marine. Moving on to some of the patterns of bolt gun. The most famous pattern known in the Imperium is the Godwin pattern. Now, this Godwin pattern is used most commonly by the Space Marines, and is known as the Astartes Mark 5B Godwin pattern, just to give it its full technical name. It has a built-in ammo counter, and uses a dexterity locking mechanism with a sickle-shaped magazine that can carry up to 30 rounds. It fires the standard .75 caliber bolt used by the Adeptus Astartes, and other features included are palm print sensors, usually included in the grip or handle of such weapons, designed to prevent anyone other than the Astartes from using them, and also can use integrated targeting mechanisms that are designed to interface with a Space Marine's armour and actually allow them to literally see along the scope of their bolter and know exactly who they're firing at. Moving on from the Godwin pattern, the next pattern I want to mention is the Angelus bolt gun. Now, the Angelus bolt gun is actually used by the Blood Angels chapter of the Space Marines, and is actually a wrist-mounted drum-fed pattern of bolter, thus allowing Space Marines who have a great deal of armour to fire whilst wielding close combat weaponry, as their hand is unobscured by the grip of a bolt gun. I'll just talk about a few more patterns of bolt gun, then we'll move on to other weaponry within the Space Marines Armory. Another mark is the Mark IV bolt gun. Now, it's actually slightly different from a standard bolter, as this is designed to be used in single shot or burst fire modes, unlike a standard bolter that can actually fire in streams. It incorporates the palm print sensor as used by many Space Marines, but it does not include things like ranged sights and scoping, in order to cut down on the weight that is carried by the Space Marine. Another pattern is the Phobos pattern bolter. This is actually associated with older patterns of armour along with the older pattern bolter, and is actually probably one of the oldest designs of weapon used by the Space Marines, not including the ancient designs of plasma guns and melter guns to be mentioned later. The actual bolters themselves were crafted by the Fabricator General of Mars years and years before the Great Crusade, over 10,000 years before the current date in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and it is treasured by every single chapter. Every single bolter is usually used either by a veteran or one of those who is lucky enough to be assigned the older style armour. One final pattern of bolter is the Umbra pattern bolt gun, and as actually used in the later years of the Great Crusade after the Phobos pattern bolter, and was actually mass-produced during the Horus Heresy in order to ensure that the Space Marine legions did not run out of any bolt guns, although this does mean that there is a slightly inferior nature to the bolt gun, not featuring some of the palm grip sensors or integrated targeting mechanisms that were included in later models. Moving on from the bolt gun, we will now mention the bolt pistol. Now, as it is clear, the bolt pistol is actually a smaller version of the bolt gun. It is quite stubby, it's almost a square in its shape, and is designed to be used not only by Space Marines actually, but it is also allowed to be used by people such as Imperial Guard officers and the Sisters of Battle. They are quite favoured outside the Space Marine Corps, but inside Space Marine chapters they are quite a common weapon. They are designed to be used mainly in close combat, and are considered secondary armaments compared to the other armaments used by the Space Marines, although the most common sight on any battlefield is usually an Assault Marine carrying a bolt pistol and a chainsword in order to be most effective in close combat. There is also a heavier version of the bolt gun known as the Heavy Bolter, ironically, and it is actually designed to be used as a suppression weapon on battlefields. Now these weapons are gigantic, they are almost the size of a Space Marine themselves, and are usually backpack fed or fed from another source, because obviously there's so much ammunition that needs to be drawn into this bolter in order to fire a massive stream of bolt shells. It actually needs a separate source of ammunition. They are commonly used by Space Marine Devastator squads, but can be used within a Space Marine Tactical squad in order to lay down some suppression fire before a charging enemy. Now, the final version of bolter that I want to mention today is actually the Storm Bolter. Now this is slightly rarer than your common bolter, and actually just looks like two bolt guns that have been welded together along lengthways, thus creating almost a double-barreled bolter. Now this is fed by two magazines, thus providing separate ammunition for both barrels, and is usually used either by Terminators or the captains of a company or of the chapter. They are quite commonly used as suppression weapons when charging into assault, and can lay down a prestigious amount of fire. Moving on from purely bolt weapons, I now want to talk about something known as a Combi-Weapon. Now this is slightly more uncommon in the Space Marine Armory, and you will be forgiven for never having heard of a Combi-Weapon. But in basic terms, a Combi-Weapon uses as a base a bolt gun. However, they also have integrated into their systems usually another style of weapon, which can either be underslung or overslung, depending on the style of weapon. They can be anything from Space Marine Armory, and they are usually things like flamethrowers, plasma guns, and can even be melter guns. Now these are very rare pieces of kit, and are very, very rarely given to anyone other than the most prestigious and most well-renowned members of a chapter. Moving on from the combi weapons, we also have the flamers. Now flamers are incredibly common, they're even used in today's battlefields, but they're slightly more advanced in the Space Marine Armory. They use something known as promethium, a sticky substance which is also highly flammable, and when fired from a flamethrower is almost like napalm. It can stick to any surface that it touches, and usually can be used against heavily armoured enemies to quite literally cook them from the inside, and also used against large swarms of enemies such as the Tyranids employ in their battles. Moving on from flamers onto something slightly more science fictional is the plasma weaponry. Now, plasma weaponry is a common term used in virtually every science fiction universe to denote weapons that fire highly charged energy at an enemy. But they're slightly different in the 40k universe, as they are actually designed to use normal fuel materials and energize them into a state known as plasma, the same stuff that the sun is made of, thus giving the plasma weapons their usual moniker sun guns. When fired, the fuel of the plasma gun is energized, and then it actually unleashes the weapon in bolts of pure energy, not to be confused, of course, with bolts fired from a bolt gun. This energy is actually encased in a magnetic containment field, thus preventing it from being like a flamethrower and making it more into a ranged weapon. Once the plasma comes into contact with solid material, the magnetic field that it was encased in ruptures and vents the superheated energy directly onto a target. The enemy is then usually either badly burnt, probably having holes in them, or in fact completely vaporized, depending on the power of the plasma weapon. They are actually incredibly dangerous to wield, as plasma weaponry was designed in the Dark Age of technology, which was roughly 15,000 years before the current date, and it has actually been not refined as such, it's less refined now than it was. It is based on an incomplete template that was found, and thus the actual weaponry itself is prone to both overheating and actually exploding if the owner is unlucky enough to get a jam or from the systems to actually react to being used so much. A plasma explosion is incredibly dangerous and can kill many people in its radius. It will usually both kill the user and can kill many of the surrounding, both Space Marines and other men and women, thus making it less a weapon of practicality and more a weapon of terror. Seeing what happens when your friend is hit by a ball of energised plasma is hardly going to make you want to fight. There are other types of plasma weapon, and I'll just mention them now. There are plasma pistols, which work on the same principle as bolt pistols using plasma weaponry, and also plasma cannons. Now, plasma cannons, differing from the plasma pistol and the plasma gun, which is usually wielded by Space Marines, plasma cannons is another devastator weapon, and can usually fire huge bursts of plasma, which are very good at suppressing heavily armoured enemies and light vehicles, usually going quite far to penetrating their armour and destroying any danger that they cause. Moving on to another style of weapon that the Space Marines can wield are melter weapons. Now, many people confuse melter weaponry with flamer weaponry because they both use the principles of heat to do their damage. However, melted weaponry is slightly different in the way that it works. How it actually operates, it uses subatomic agitation in the air, which targets a path along the barrel and out into the area directly in front of the Space Marine in what could be described as a laser beam, although obviously it doesn't use the principles of laser. Now, the effect on both armour and flesh is incredibly intense. It quite literally reduces it to molten slag, and the heat is so intense that it will be used primarily to destroy heavy weaponry, large tanks, and other items. Now, they usually use pressurized petrol-style gases in a two-part injection system in order to prevent these two gases from mixing and actually blowing up the weapon when it's fired. This weaponry will vaporize huge numbers of items and will be used primarily as not only a weapon of terror but a weapon of high efficiency, as it is slightly more efficient than the plasma-based weaponry, which is based on incomplete principles. However, there are disadvantages. Of course, the range of a melter weapon is quite low due to the fact that subatomic agitation can usually be dispersed by other gases in the air, and it is also hugely power consuming, thus resulting that a Space Marine using a melter weapon will have to either reload very regularly or only be able to fire a few shots before having to return to more conventional bolter weaponry. They are still prized though by many Space Marines, and they are considered a good alternative to the plasma-based weapon, and because obviously they are quite a terrorizing weapon, they can be used in both instances when it is considered too dangerous to use plasma-based weaponry in case the plasma-based weaponry blows you up in the process. Now, some examples of melter-based weaponry are melter guns, which are, as they say on the tin, just general melter weapons, handheld inferno pistols, which have slightly different names but operate on the same principle as melter weaponry, although they are very rare and primarily used by the Space Marines chapter of Blood Angels. And there are also the heavy multi-melters. Now, multi-melters are also a rare sight in the Imperium because obviously a Devastator squad, who is usually the person who wields a heavy weapon, is very rarely close enough to the battle in order to deal damage with melter-based weaponry, and so thus they usually go for something like a plasma cannon or a las gun. However, they can also be mounted to fast vehicles such as attack bikes and land speeders, thus allowing this very powerful beam weapon to actually be brought into close contact with heavy infantry and with heavy armour, and dealing a lot of damage in the process. Moving off some heavy weaponry onto something more conventional that we'll all recognise are shotguns. Now, shotguns used by Space Marines, they are slightly different to other Imperial style shotguns. They actually lack a lot of power compared to the standard bolt pistol or bolt gun that are used by most other Space Marines, but because the Space Marine shotgun is usually used by their scouts, it's actually a good alternative, training them to use powerful weapons before upgrading them into full Space Marines. Also, they are usually more useful to a scout due to the fact that scouts will get in quite close to the enemy and can be fired easily and operated easily compared to a bolt gun, also dealing a lot of damage to lightly armoured enemies, as anyone who's used a shotgun will know. Next up, we'll talk about the sniper rifle. Now again, this is another common weapon and I won't spend too much time talking about this. However, a Space Marine sniper rifle actually uses solid shells and boasts powerful telescopic sight, however slightly more advanced than the scopes and snipers other forces in the Imperium. Because it is not laser based, it can deal a lot of damage to heavy armoured enemies, and thus is used actually by the snipers as much as by other Space Marines, because it gives them the advantage of range and allows them to survive longer when dealing combat damage. Now, moving past some of the lighter weaponry that's handheld, I'll now go on to some of the heavier weaponry that is either actually used by dreadnoughts, tanks, and other heavy weaponry. The most common heavy weapon in the entire Imperium, in fact, is an autocannon. Now, this is very common, and similar to what we'd consider a 20th century tank gun. They fire a wide variety of ammunition, of course, which can range from incendiary to solid shot, to, in fact, poison-based weaponry, although this is incredibly rare, and it's usually employed as anti-light vehicle or anti-heavy infantry due to its solid nature, but not due to its armour-penetrating power, as that is slightly reduced by the fact that it's a solid shell. Another heavy weapon that's actually mounted either onto dreadnoughts and sometimes onto terminators is an assault cannon. Now, an assault cannon is a heavy automatic anti-personnel weapon. It's very rarely used against heavy armour, and I'll explain that in a moment. The most notable feature of the assault cannon is actually its incredible rate of fire, far beyond a bolt gun, storm bolter, or anything else. It easily eclipses the autocannon in its rate of fire, and it uses medium caliber rotary autocannon shells with 6 barrels to actually fire weaponry incredibly quickly into the enemy. It was actually developed in a Horus Heresy to replace the autocannon, which was actually very common with Terminator armour. However, it is still considered quite disadvantageous to have only assault cannons in the army, as it actually lacks some of the range that an autocannon can provide, and is actually prone to overheating and jamming. Because when you're firing hundreds of bullets a second, it is very common for such a weapon to be subject to the laws of physics. It's common for an assault cannon to reach 300 degrees C when firing, and thus meaning that even though the spinning of the autocannon can help to cool the barrels, it's still a risk when firing that you could conceivably jam your weapon and thus be left both unarmed and vulnerable to any enemy that's incoming. Some advantages to an assault cannon over an autocannon are, of course, because of its high rate of fire, it can actually be used to essentially chop unarmoured enemies into pieces. It fires so quickly that it will bore through multiple enemies, and in combat against lightly armoured enemies such as orcs or against the Tyranids or other such enemies, it can quite literally tear them to shreds before they've even got close to the Space Marines themselves. Its prestigious rate of fire is of course offset by the fact that it overheats, and also that it is quite heavy. Even a Space Marine in dreadnought armour struggles to carry an assault cannon while on the move, and thus is usually mounted to the very large and very well armoured dreadnoughts, giving them a lot of anti-infantry power combined with their heavy armour. Moving on from the assault cannon for now, we go back to something which is quite common in today's universe, and that is the missile launcher. Now, I'm sure you will have all come across missile launchers in the real world, both through the media, and you may have even come across them in real life. And now, in the 40k universe, they fire a distinct number of shells that can be used in various situations on the battlefield. They can fire frags, which are, like they say on the tin, fragmentation missiles, that when they explode they cause incredible damage to the surrounding area, and are most commonly used against anti-infantry. They also fire crack ammunition, spelt with a K, and is quite literally used to crack open enemy armour. It's so powerful, in fact, that it is usually used as an anti-tank round. There are also other types of missile launcher for me to mention in the Space Marine Armory, this most notably being the Cyclone missile launcher. Now, this type is actually designed to fit on top of a Terminator, and looks very much like a set of missile batteries that you would usually see attached to a tank, albeit being quite smaller. These provide the Terminators with even more power, allowing them to use missiles against their enemies that can be fired both stationary and on the move. Now, the old style of Space Marine Cyclone missile launcher actually replaced the Terminator's Power Fist with an aiming device. Now, in today's age, they have taken away the aiming device and given them back their Power Fist. However, it does mean that the Cyclone missile launcher is far less accurate than a usual missile launcher due to this lack of an aiming device. Moving past the handheld weaponry, we're now going to go on to a few of the tank weapons, most notably the Demolisher Cannon. Now, a Demolisher Cannon is a short-range, large-bore, direct-fire cannon mounted usually on the Space Marine Vindicator. It is obviously a siege weapon, judging by its dimensions, and it will actually be used for urban and bunker-busting tank warfare. It's also very useful against enemy vehicles and enemy infantry. Considering the large-style shell that it drops on people, it will obviously deal a lot of damage. Now, the ammunition is actually a large-caliber rocket-assisted shell, and can have an armor-piercing tip, a heavy shell casing, and very large explosive charge. It is one of the largest pieces of ammunition used in the Space Marine Armory outside the Starship cannons. Each shell rocket actually has an engine, which is fueled by a solid propellant, thus making it even more explosive when it lands in the midst of the enemy. And it is shaped and charged in a certain way so that when it is fired, it will fall with the maximum amount of damage being caused to the enemy. In order to avoid blastback, because of the fact that these shells are rocket-assisted, the gas used in the rockets has to be vented every time the cannon is fired in order to prevent the barrel from deforming or being overpressured. Once fired, the shell will actually fly through the air very quickly, and is designed to explode microseconds after the penetration, not on penetration, allowing it to actually go through several layers of armor or building to explode with enough force to deal the most damage. The only main drawback with the Demolisher cannon is the fact that it has very limited range because of its small size and large amount of explosives loaded into the shell, thus meaning that a Space Marine Vindicator will actually have to get up close and personal with the enemy, and may mean that it comes within line of fire of the enemy's anti-tank weaponry, which is of course always a bad thing. However, because of this, they will usually arm a Vindicator with a lot more armor and dozer blades in order to deal with that, but it does mean that the Vindicator is a trade-off between the power of the Demolisher cannon and the likelihood it might get blown up. Moving back to a very common weapon in the Space Marine Armory, and considered one of the most powerful for a Space Marine themselves to wield, is the las cannon. Commonly either attached to tanks or carried by Devastator Marines, a las cannon is a formidable weapon, using the common technology of las weaponry or laser weaponry, which is used throughout the Imperium and usually applied to the Imperial Guard. The las cannon, despite being incredibly powerful and able to penetrate even the toughest armor, does have drawbacks as well. It has a slow recharge rate and expends its ammunition clip every blast, and so thus has to be reloaded, much like a missile launcher is. They usually have to have the las cannon actually integrated into the power armor of the Space Marine if they are carried personally, because of the general weight and power would require quite a lot of bracing to prevent the aim from being thrown off. There are also other problems with the las cannon, it being very susceptible to damage, and it can also damage itself just through overuse, meaning that it is a trade-off between the prestigious power that can be provided by a las cannon and the likelihood that you will be unable to use your weapon at the end of the battle. Another uncommon piece of weaponry used by the Space Marines is the Thunderfire cannon. Now this is quite a recognisable piece of kit to anyone who plays the board game, and it's actually a very large multi-barrelled cannon. Now, usually a Thunderfire cannon has to be used by a Space Marine Tech Marine. Due to its nature, it requires the constant supervision of someone who is trained in such extensively powerful weaponry in order to allow it to fire during the battle. An exception to the general rule regarding Space Marine weaponry being highly portable, the Thunderfire cannon is most usually used where mobile artillery platforms such as the Vindicator or the Space Marine Whirlwind tank cannot operate, thus in highly rugged terrain or on mountainous passes, and can also be used in defensive armaments far more effectively than on the battlefield. It actually has 4 barrels and allows it to unleash a punishing rate of fire, firing 3 different varieties of shot. The first type of shot detonates on surface contact with the enemy, commonly used against infantry in the open, and there is also an airburst shell, which is employed against infantry taking cover, very similar to a frag grenade, allowing damage over a small area. And the most devastating, however, is the subterranean shell. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, how on earth do you have a shell that goes underground? But what actually happens is the Thunderfire cannon fires a shell that is programmed to burrow into the ground before exploding. The result causes a large seismic disruption which can knock the enemy off balance, making them easier targets when the Space Marines come in for the kill. It actually affects even gravity vehicles, whose anti-gravity generators are negatively impacted when subsurface shockwaves caused by their shells disrupt the locational distance between the ground and the grav vehicle itself.